Our talk is based on an article, Software and Practice, the Contribution of the Founders of Operations Research, which Francis and I have been working on for many years, and it's been published in Operations Research. Next slide, Francis. What we want to talk about in the talk, which of course isn't the whole paper, is we want to introduce the founders of OR. Who are these people? Why are we interested in the topic? Something about software and problem structuring methods. That's the PSM's problem structuring methods. And then we should say something about the founders who directly influence the software pioneers. And then we'll look at many other founders who had software characteristics. We'll say a little bit about the founders and practice, and then some concluding thoughts. Next, Francis. Well, we didn't invent the founders. The founders that we're referring to are profiled in a book by Assad and Gass, which was launched at an Informs conference either at Austin or Charlotte. I'm not sure which I attended, and I think I've been alerted to this book by Graham Rand, who's one of the authors. And the editors set out to profile 50 founders, but when they went to press, they only had 43. They're mainly Americans. There are a number of Brits in there. Martin Beale, Stafford Beer, Patrick Blackett, Patrick Rosette. So there's a number of British in there. And I think there's about one of the European, Bernard Roy, but they're predominantly Americans. They are all men. Maybe Elsa Land might have been a candidate, but she isn't profiled in there. But things have moved on since the days when OR was all men. Next, Francis. Why are we interested in this topic? Well, I actually bought the book at the conference, and I started reading it as my bedtime reading, and I think it's the only academic book I've actually read from cover to cover. And when I was reading it, it struck me that a lot of these people who we don't associate at all with software did seem to have soft tendencies. And I was having a coffee with Francis one day, and we chatted about this and thought, well, maybe this is worth exploring properly. Incidentally, this is one of those informal chats that perhaps don't happen today with all this online stuff and people not meeting in person. So we're interested because we're well aware that software is well established in the UK, and John Mingus wrote a strong article on that. And there was also a discussion in ORMS today about whether software was OR, and there is a view out there, particularly in North America, that software is not real OR. And the leading Informs journals, the leading US journals, Management Science and Operations Research, haven't published software. And indeed, a previous editor-in-chief of Operations Research said he would never publish anything to do with software. So being aware of the background about problems about software being accepted, and just thinking that there was something in this founders business that might help us on that front, we decided we'd try and explore properly the extent to which the founders relate to principles of software. And this was from an academic perspective, if you like, and you will probably be aware that HORAF are writing a report on the software practice, which John Ranyard and others are writing at the moment. Thanks, Francis. Next. software and problem structuring methods, well, they emerged due to a concern that, more than a concern perhaps, that OR, as it was quantitative OR, or OR as it was in the 60s and 70s and before, couldn't solve wicked problems, ill-structured problems. Indeed, I think in John Hawke's recent article in Inside OR, he mentioned that he'd been introduced to soft OR at a meeting at Shell in the 70s, and I attended that meeting, and my recollection, I have a recollection that I think it was Jonathan Rodenhead, who outlined a complex problem, a wicked problem, and then he put up an integer programming formulation, which he kind of scorned as obviously not being suitable to solve this problem, and therefore we needed something different, i.e. problem structuring methods, or soft OR. At the time, I had been teaching integer programming, and I have the temerity to point out that the integer programming model that had been put up was actually a very poor model of the situation, and I could think of much better formulations that might have some value. However, that was not a well-received comment, and I was scorned for my comment, although I did get out of the meeting alive. So there was a real feeling at that time that hard mathematical OR was not suitable for these kinds of problems. When we looked into in more detail soft OR and PSMs, we found that these terms were often used interchangeably. So for the purpose of our paper anyway, we said that soft OR is a complete approach from problem structuring to decision without the development and solution of a quantitative model, whereas PSMs are specific methodologies designed to enact soft OR. Thanks, Francis. So as we wanted to explore the links between the founders and soft OR, we looked at what the soft OR people said soft OR actually was, and we put together, we collected an aggregation of their ideas, and we put them into context, which is wicked problems, ill-defined problem situation, multiple access stakeholders, high degrees of uncertainty, intangibles, qualitative and limited quantitative data. So that's the context of soft OR. The process, of course, is engagement with and interactions between stakeholders, and usually in workshops, either real or real or virtual. And there's a very much a concern with the process issues and procedural rationality. And the content, the third leg of this, the content is, of course, diagrammatic models such as rich pictures and cognitive maps and so on, which are transparent and understandable, and they're a focus for discussion in these workshops. So that was our characteristics. Those were our characteristics of soft OR that we used in our research into the founders. Okay, Francis. Do you want to take over now, Francis?
Yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Brilliant. Yeah. Thank you. Hello, everyone. So we've looked at characteristics of soft OR approaches. What I'm going to do next is just talk about how some of the founders influenced second generation, I guess, if you like, rather than founders, those that actually developed soft OR problem structuring approaches. So I've just listed a selection here. When you talk about problem structuring methods, often people just talk about the top three, but in the book, Rational Analysis for a Problematic World, versions 1 and 2, they do include other methods. So let's just have a little look. If you hear snoring in the background, it's my little dog who's sitting next to me. let's have a look at some of these. Right, yes, so starting with the work of Colin Eden, which you're all very familiar with, I'm sure. So there's many citations within Eden's work to the work of the founders, and we've just listed a few of them here. The eagle-eyed amongst you might spot that Mason and Mitroff are not actually included in the list of the founders. Perhaps they should have been. But as you can see here, Colin uses a lot of the work of the founders in his work and has cited a lot of their works, a good range of them. Secondly, Strategic Choice Approach by John Friend. John's work was very practitioner oriented, so there's not too many references to go on in terms of citations, but we had a look at his work and we've inferred influences from the bibliography of that key text, Planning Under Pressure, where him and Hickling describe the strategic choice approach. And again, you can see that there are a number of founders that have influenced that work. Moving on to the work of Peter Checkland with soft systems methodology, bringing up the big three. Whilst his work was developed outside of the OR community, we do tend to accept that it's a leading soft OR method, don't we? And in his early work, he cites the work of Acuff, Beer and Churchman as being influences of his work. So we can see already with the top three most commonly cited PSM approaches that there's a lot of influence coming from the founders of OR. So just to finish off that list that I showed you earlier on, if we look at drama theory, decision conferencing and robustness analysis, again, you can see in bold, I've highlighted some of the founders that influenced their work. So the point of all this really is to say that there were a number of the founders that did influence our soft OR pioneers. And again, the eagle-eyed amongst you, if you know anything about the founders, will have spotted that these founders are at the less mathematical end of the spectrum, shall we say. So I now want to move on just to talk about the founders and how we saw links with the work of the founders and the soft OR characteristics. So before I do that, I just want to remind you of the things that we were looking for when we were reading through the book and other sources. So we used Pettigrew's context, process, content framework to help organise our characteristics. And I'm going to look at each of these areas now and just give you a few examples of the founders that we found exhibiting some of these characteristics. So we'll start with context. So remember, in context, we're talking about ill-defined situations, multiple stakeholders with different views, a high degree of uncertainty. And here are just 4 examples. In the paper, we go into a lot more detail with more examples of founders who we believe exhibited some of these contextual characteristics. Now, these names may not be familiar to all of you, so let me just take you through. So Bellman is associated with dynamic programming. But given that he was associated with dynamic programming, he was also interested in applications where the qualitative features were important. Saul Gass is associated with LP, optimization, analytic hierarchy process, amongst other things. And his work recognised the involvement of multiple stakeholders with differing objectives. Gomery is associated with integer programming, and his application area, that the problem of international trade, you could argue is a wicked problem area, you know, by definition of involving different nations with very different perspectives and priorities. And then finally on this slide, Little, who is associated with queuing theory, Little's law. He was concerned about issues with multiple stakeholders, different perspectives and ill-defined problem situations. Moving on to process. So just to remind you, by process characteristics, we mean engagement with and interactions between stakeholders. It might involve the use of facilitated sessions or workshops. And another characteristic is the concern for process issues or procedural rationality. So Gass, Gomery and Little, I've already mentioned to you. Arnoff wrote with Churchman and Akoff perhaps the first textbook on OR. Now, he was interested in process issues, probably, as it says here, due to his belief in the importance of social capital. I was doing a little bit of background research before this session, and I found something that he'd written, and I thought this really does fit with this notion of soft OR characteristics and process issues. He wrote an article in Planning Review in 1976 called "Managers Should Marry Models." I thought that was quite funny. The other three examples, again, as you can see from the text here, we're claiming exhibit some of these process characteristics. So Gass is recognising the use of teams in helping to structure problems, and that there may well be different people, different stakeholders and groups involved. Same with Gomery, recognising that multiple stakeholders are going to be concerned with international trade, and they may well have different and conflicting objectives. And then Little, in his realm of queuing theory, again recognised the place for different stakeholders in the decision process. So finally, looking at the content characteristics, reminding you that this is mainly about the use of models as a focus for discussion, and these are often diagrammatic models. So who have we got here? Well, Bloomstein. Bloomstein was interested in criminology and the criminal justice system, and he made use of diagrammatic flow models there as a precursor to quantitative models, so very much like the field of system dynamics. Gass, I've already mentioned to you, he used diagrammatic models to structure problems within the analytic hierarchy process work that he did. Kosmetsky, there's a nice piece in the book that talks about his use of George diagrams, and he was associated, I believe, with DEA and the field of finance. And then finally on this slide, an example from Bezogne, who had a goes into diagram. I loved the way they named that. Simple things showing a pictorial representation in his optimization models, looking into materials requirements. And he was very much using these models as a communicative device to help explain the models. So just a couple of examples now of these diagrammatic approaches. So here we have the goes into diagram. It's just taken from the book to show you what that looks like, a very simple picture. But we did find some examples, not a huge number, where people were using such diagrams. So as it says here, capture, represent complexity as a facilitation device, and to support debate amongst stakeholders and various interested parties. And we've got a couple of little quotes for you here from Little and Bezogne showing that they're using such diagrams. Another diagram, just to show you here, it was taken from Bonder, and this differentiates between two worlds back in the early 1970s. And this resonates with the work of Peter Checkland with SSM. So in summary, we are finding that there, as I said, are a few examples where people have used diagrammatic models. As we were reading the book, one of the things that really struck me, you know, I don't know what generation of OI I am, third generation or something like that. You know, some of these were simply names to me. I didn't know a lot about it. So as I was reading the book, the thing that really struck me was how these guys were rooted in practice. They were And not only the hard modelers, but the soft OR pioneers as well have all been rooted in practice. So this slide just explains some examples of that. So many were practitioners prior to entering academia and perhaps became practicing academics. So here are just a few examples here. A lot of them were around the time of the Second World War, but not all of them. Some of them started their careers during that time, but then went on into industry prior to entering academia. Many of them were motivated to engage with real interventions and problems, as it shows here with Danzig, Gass and Little. And many of them recognised, therefore, because they were rooted in practice and had to talk to managers, they recognised the need to engage with and communicate with their clients. So at this point, I think I'll hand it back to Robert. Yes. Are you there, Robert?
Oh, okay. Yeah, and one of the interesting things we need reminding about. I mean, I was in a talk not long ago where somebody from the operations management field, a senior person there, was categorizing operational research as a sort of a bunch of techniques looking for a problem to solve. And of course, the truth of the history is completely the way around. I mean, many of the early key developments in OR came because people engaged with practice and had to develop methods to solve the problems. They didn't pick them out of a toolbox, they actually developed them on the job, if you like, as happened, of course, in World War II. So Ballast developed his travelling salesman problem as a result of his work with the steel and scheduling steel. Gomery studied steel plants, glass plants and paper mills to develop and which led to his seminal work on cutting stock problems, which in fact Gilmore and Gomery's 3 articles, I think there were 3 actually, on the cutting stock problem were very prominent in my my PhD, which was on how to best to cut up bits of glass. Reifer became interested in public policy problems, which led to his pioneering work on multi-attribute alternatives, which laid the foundations of multi-criteria analysis. So, and there are many more examples of this that we came across, which many of you older people out there will be aware of this, but maybe the younger ones don't. That you know, they didn't just emerge from theoretical thoughts, these methods, they emerged out of practice. So we thought that was that about the origins of operational research. Okay. So to summarize, software pioneers were heavily influenced by a subset of the founders. A wider group of founders, a much wider group of founders, often characterized as hard modelers, actually aligned with many of the software characteristics. So that the connection between the founders and software is much broader than perhaps might be first thought. As we just said, the proponents of software and the founders are heavily engaged in practice. And there is strong evidence, so we argue there's very strong evidence, both from the founders, also from the definitions of OR that we went into, the inductive and deductive reasoning of software, which is part of the scientific method, that those two together, and we've concentrated more on the founders side here, mean that software is indeed a legitimate subset of OR, and really the American people who don't allow software really ought to perhaps reconsider their position. The full paper, as I say, has been published in the Informs journal Operations Research, which maybe means that there's a little hope that there's some hope of getting other soft papers published in Operations Research if anybody is brave enough to attempt it. Next, Francis. So going forward, I mean, that's all history, but what our feeling is that hard OR, which has to formulate problems, but often just in a very ad hoc way, and in hard OR modelling ought to embrace the more rigorous and transparent approach of soft OR. So that the formulation, problem structuring formulation side of hard OR ought to be rather more rigorous and in line with the approaches of soft OR. For the soft ORs, we would perhaps suggest that there's some debate about, whether this is a PSM or not, or is that a PSM? And although I wouldn't want to close down that debate, perhaps soft OR should be more concerned with generic problem structuring, because problem structuring occurs everywhere, whether it leads to hard models or whether it doesn't lead to hard models. And I think the soft OR people have got much to offer the OR community at large in their approach to problem structuring. And of course, mixed models, which we talk about in the paper, mixed modeling indeed formed a platform for hard and soft communities to engage mutually. Thank you.
Okay. Francis, did you have anything more to the final slide, or are you?
No, that's just a few references that were referred to as we went through the paper. Shall I stop sharing now?
Yeah, that would be handy. Thank you very much. Okay, thanks to Robert and Francis for that talk. Lots to debate there. Happy to take comments from the floor, but I wondered if we could first start with the slides referenced both the Inside OR article that John Hopes pulled together and some of the surveying that was done through our heads of OR and Analytics Forum, and John Ranyard, John Hopes are both on the call. I wondered if either of you would be happy to just give a very brief update as to what went on there and what the findings were.
I can do that, Gavin, if that's okay.
Thanks, John.
You can all hear me. This initiative aiming to reinvigorate soft OR for practitioners arose at a Harath meeting last November, when members present commented on the lack then, because of COVID, of reliable historic data and more a need for soft OR. And a number of members were carrying out more soft OR than before. Obviously, it's known that government DSTL and some private consultancies used soft OR, but the private companies probably less so. So our aim was just to look at the current state of play of soft OR with the aim of promoting it back to practitioners. We sort of enlarged that largely because of John Hopes, who obviously was involved in the early stages of this, to look to benefit the whole of the OR community. So we've tried to take a state of play on the use of soft OR and those involved as of now. And we interviewed quite a lot of people, and we've got together a lot of information which we presented to the heads of OR with our thoughts about what they can do in order to be better equipped to carry out soft OR. And we are now in the process of writing a detailed report, which is looking at the whole of the OR community's involvement in soft OR and what training facilities are available and so on. And that report, or at least a summary of that, will be presented at the OR conference, OR 63. And hopefully we'll be able to make it more widely available. But basically we found an increase in interest by practitioners and academics in soft OR, and a strong movement, well, two things really. One, not just using the PSMs or systems thinking in full, but using some of the elements like rich pictures, stakeholder analysis, and so on, particularly at the beginning of a project. And that would help to form a better basis for a future hard project or continuing with a soft project analysis. And the steering group of HORAF are discussing what further we might do to support practitioners. So maybe John would like to add a comment to that. John Hopes, sorry, two Johns.
John, no, I think you covered it very well. I think the only thing I would add is that one of the early findings was that the OR Society's PSM special interest group is really thriving, and this group has grown into probably our second largest group after the analytics network in just a couple of years. And you know, so that does show that there is real strength of interest in the field, both from practitioners and academics, because that group actually covers both. I think that's all I would add, John.
Great, thanks to both Johns. If anyone else would like to comment or ask a question, can you raise your electronic hand, and you can have the opportunity to contribute. Graham's raising his real hand. Let's have Graham first.
Okay, thank you, and thank you, Francis and Robert. It's good to hear and see you, Francis. It was good to hear from you, Robert. I just wondered whether you had any reaction from the States. You know, you mentioned the antipathy that they have towards soft OR. I wondered if you'd had any feedback, since I presume the paper's still in articles in advance, but maybe it's got beyond that. I haven't followed. And in particular, I mean, obviously some of the people you're mentioning are still alive and kicking and very active in forums, John Little and Al Bloomstein. I wondered if you'd heard anything from them.
No, not a dicky bird so far, unless Robert's heard something. You're on mute, Robert. Are you still there? I know you're having connection problems earlier. Let's assume he's having connection problems.
All going to be on you then, Francis. Okay, so right, yeah, we've got a hand from Whole Law. If you'd like to go ahead.
Hello, everybody. Thank you. Yes, I suppose from my experience in operation research, the soft ORs always seem to be in the margin in working in a team with OR practitioners who tend to be a very hard OR, in my experience, that is, characterized by computer scientists, statisticians, and physicists, and so on and so forth, the hard scientists. And I'm interested about one of the last slides about the definition of OR, because in my limited training in OR, it seems OR is perceived as the applied mathematics, and that seemed to therefore naturally come in line with the hard edge modeling mathematicians and statisticians and hard scientists. So soft scientists is not part of the team, and that is in practice in my observation and experiences. So back to the definitions, if the definition of OR can be redefined to include the soft problems and modeling, I think we would have a good foundation and grounding. I think the problem back to the beginning of the root definition of OR itself is always problematic. So I wonder whether it would, in terms of we embrace the theory and practices of OR, or soft OR, I just wonder whether we should revisit the age-old definition of OR itself.
I think that's probably a question for Gavin and Edmund. What I would say is, having been involved in the OR Society for many years, the formal definition that the Society promotes has on occasions been very inclusive. I have to confess, I don't know what the most up-to-date version is, and therefore how inclusive it is, but I do know that in the past it has been. That's the first point I'd say. I do think you're raising a very important point, and it is one thing that really concerns me about our OR education, which has by and large been rebranded analytics education, and that is how methodological training, which to me is where the soft OR stuff can really come in, has dropped off many syllabuses. And so a lot of syllabuses now teach mostly tools and techniques and focus on the hard. So I would say it's not just, we don't need to pay attention to such definitions only in how as a society we define our discipline, but also how we teach it. I don't know whether Gavin or whether Robert Wunken is back with us, or whether Gavin or Edmund want to come in there.
No, I mean, I think the OR Society's definitions and Euros are fairly inclusive. But you can, if you look at the Inform's definitions, you can infer problem structuring lurking in there. It's just that they don't explicitly want to mention problem structuring methods or soft OR.
So, can I just come in there as I was to say that I think the Operational Research Society's definitions, and indeed all its practices and its activities, should be and will be as inclusive as possible. So if there is any kind of an issue where you think we can improve the inclusivity, then I think you need to approach us and we need to look at it, and we need to employ the processes and the procedures of the society to ensure that we are as inclusive as possible.
Thanks, Edmund. I think John Hope's next with the hand up.
Thanks, Gavin. Yeah, I was just wondering, Francis and Robert, whether you'd identified any interesting unexplored avenues in your work. I mean, for example, softish work that was done by the founders that wasn't picked up by the second generation, but which might involve methods, approaches, techniques that could be a useful addition to the soft OR toolkit. Anything of that nature?
I think the thing that struck me about the hard people, we know quite a lot in the soft OR community and the PSM community about links back to the founders that you would associate with that drive, the Churchmans and the ACOF. We know a lot about them. The thing that was new to me was what the hard people were doing, and that they were exhibiting a number of these characteristics. So to me, that's an unexplored area, and as Graham rightly pointed out, some of them are still alive. That would be a really interesting avenue to explore with them. How, in the early days when these problems were messy that they initially dealt with, how did they go about structuring them in such a way that then they became quite tame and could have these methods applied to them? So things like that goes into diagram and Bonder with his different worlds, that there's stuff like that was really new to me.
Yeah, I think we found hints about generic approaches to problem structuring, John, but not perhaps any specific what might be called PSMs, I suppose.
Okay, thank you.
Ruth, you had your hand up, but it's disappeared.
Yeah, that's because I don't have that much to add. I did put something in the chat, and I paid the price of putting something in the chat too soon before I'd seen all the slides. So I do want to endorse that final set of recommendations, which is that you can structure your problems without using a problem structuring method. And I do agree that this is something that has its roots in practice, that if you're going to work in practice, then you come across these issues. So then, and the question that I was asking was whether our problem is that people don't recognize that sharing experience and methods and learning on how to tackle those issues counts as OR. And I think that associates with also something that Ho was saying about whether people insist on it being hard OR or not. As I'm chair of the Euro Working Group on OR in Practice, and which has members who are practitioners from across Europe, and I'm continually surprised by their lack of any awareness of non-optimization methods, at the same time as recognizing all of those soft issues of practice that they need to tackle. So I think there's lots going on in this area, and I think this paper looks as if it's going to be really, really helpful in clarifying some of the issues around it. So thank you.
I'm going to jump in with a comment that having done quite a bit of work in recent months to do with the sort of interface between OR and data science and analytics and AI, I'm even more strongly of the view that the soft OR approaches, certainly allied to some of the harder approaches, are the things that differentiate us from people who call themselves data scientists, for example. And I think that's a strong element that we bring to the game, and something that we should be using to strengthen our position, strengthen what we offer.
Yeah, and for the soft people to be more inclusive, if that makes sense, or to be more, to see themselves addressing the hard community rather than just talking to themselves, which often happens. I mean, I've been to numerous soft OR streams at international conferences, and it tends to be the soft people talking to themselves, and we need to find a way of the soft people talking to the hard people more consistently.
Okay, any more comments from anyone? Any more questions?
Can I just say, everyone, just a point about the analysis carried out by Robert and Francis. There was a conference in 1964, OR and the social sciences, which I think was an attempt to bring in a better understanding of social processes into OR. And I'm sure some of the founders, although there are only 3 or 4 that Robert and Francis looked at, I'm sure they were involved in that conference. And just another aside, the Informs Certified Analytics Professional Qualification does have quite a lot of soft OR built into it, but as Robert says, they don't publicize it very strongly.
Yes, that's right. I mean, we refer to that in the paper, John. Yes, and you're quite right. We can infer it from it, but they don't promote it in a strong way.
Yeah,
it's something that we'll mention a little later on. I've been working with a couple of other learned societies, the RSS, the British Computer Society, and the IMA, looking at professional standards in data science, and we're building a competency framework, and I'm made very sure that we've got problem structuring soft OR methods included in there. So it'll be interesting to see what that brings. Okay, I think that rounds us off for that section of the talk. Whilst I reshare my screen for the next section, over to you, Edmund.
Thank you, Gavin. And sorry, everyone, that I had connection problems getting in. It took me the best part of 10 minutes to get connected. So about 50 minutes ago, I was scheduled to welcome you all to our second virtual AGM. Let me do that now. So unfortunately, COVID restrictions mean that we can't have this in person as we would normally do, but hopefully we will be back to normal next year. So Gavin, could you move us on to yeah, thanks. So what I'd like to do is just briefly go through 2020 for you. It's been a very, very challenging and unusual year, very much dominated by the pandemic and the society's response to the pandemic. And I have said this on many occasions in public fora, but it is worth repeating that what a great debt I think the community owes to the OR Society staff, who really have gone above and beyond during this pandemic. It was a massive undertaking to switch everything online immediately, and they did it professionally. They did it with dedication, and they did it with skill. And I really am proud of and impressed by the work of our staff. So I would like to thank them again for what they've done in moving the society really seamlessly into the virtual world. And now we have the job, of course, of moving to the society into the post-COVID world. And I think we will see more hybridization of meetings, but hopefully we will get back to many more face-to-face meetings too. So as in the early days of that pandemic, we initially had to postpone our courses and events, but quickly moved to online platforms. Our staff moved to working from home, as I said, really quite seamlessly, and are still working from home. We had a serious financial problem along with the rest of society. Our reserves, if you remember, in the early days of the pandemic, there was something of a crash, and our reserves crashed along with everything else, and we had to move swiftly and decisively to protect our cash. We did that. We put in place some cost-cutting measures. Gavin will give you a bit more detail later on about the finances, but to cut a long story short, our income dropped alarmingly, and our costs had to too. We cut some of the issues of inside OR. We did not replace some of the leaving staff, and we did protect our financial position. And it has bounced back. Our reserves have bounced back now to a position where they are better than they were at the start of the pandemic. But it's a real roller coaster picture. We had a wide range of website resources that the Society put on for its membership, and various initiatives. It is worth pointing out that all the cost-cutting measures, including the staffing, have now returned to normal levels. So some of the uncertainty has gone from the situation. It was a very, very uncertain situation in the early days of the pandemic. Some but not all of that uncertainty has dissipated now, and we are back to more normal levels of spend. Gavin. So throughout 2020, in a virtual way, we have furthered our engagement with other learner societies. Gavin's already briefly alluded to this, with the Royal Society, with the Royal Academy of Engineering, with government, looking at how we can get across the message of how important OR is in so many big societal challenges that face the world. We are right at the heart of the discussion around the Big Maths Initiative and the new Academy of Mathematical Sciences. I say new, it's not been formed yet, but the OR Society is present in the discussions, and I'm confident that the OR Society will play a major role in the formation of that academy. In terms of OR62 online and our virtual events, I've already said, I think they've been a huge success. We had our largest ever global audience. I think it's, well, I'm repeating myself, but it's worth repeating. I think it's been really impressive. The implementation of the AI Task and Finish group has happened, and that has been embedded into what the society does. We've another external partnership along with the learned societies is the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales. They're taking some of our journal content and cooperating on events, especially the analytics network. Our apprenticeship standard has been approved, and we are hoping that our first cohort will start next year of apprentices. So we're working towards the ORS becoming an endpoint assessment organisation. And hopefully we will be in that position to accept a first cohort next year. Gavin. Thank you. So other highlights, I'm really pleased to report that our Women in OR and Analytics network continues to grow. We continue to engage with the Alliance for Data Science Professionals. Gavin is taking the lead on this, and I think it's progressing really well. Within the society, we're seeing continued equality, diversity and inclusion progress, which I'm particularly proud of. We have a response to the Science Council framework exercise, and our EDI task force continues to oversee progress. We have the next slide, please, Gavin. So, despite the pandemic and the issues around the pandemic, and as I said, falling income, but some of our key numbers have grown. Our membership now stands, as it says there on the slide, at 3,121. That is from 3,033 pre-pandemic. The LinkedIn figure there has grown from 4,661 and the Twitter figure from 4,559. So our engagement with social media is up across the board. The analytics network figure there of 2,105 is up from 1,600. So I think the overall story of 2020, which, as I said, a very, very unusual, very challenging year, is that the society has responded well to it and has responded to the challenges and has continued to grow. Gavin, I think we are on the financials and it's over to you.
Great, thanks, Edmund. So we've heard from Francis and Robert and Edmund. Thanks very much to my warm-up acts. I realise you have all turned up just to hear me talk about the financials. Nobody's saying no, so it must be true. Okay, I'll try and whistle.
Bill, Gavin. Top of the bill.
Exactly. I'll try and whistle through this as quickly as I can. Edmund's talked about the impact of COVID, but even despite that, we remain very healthy. Edmund's mentioned that the reserves, our investment portfolios, recovered very well since a very large drop in the end of March last year. Our total net assets stand at 2.4 million, so roughly the same level as last year. Income for the year was down about 300k. The good news is that many of the associated costs that would go along with that income were down too. So overall, we turned quite a large deficit in 2019 into a very small surplus for the year in terms of the general fund. Publishing remains still a very important part of our income, and the income from the contract with Taylor and Francis solidified further, and that was up a further 30,000 over 2019. But we still face an increased risk from open access and Plan S within that, and perhaps the knock-on impact on university budgets from COVID-19, potentially spending on journals could be one of the things that gets hit in the coming year. Our current contract with Taylor and Francis comes to an end at the end of next year, but we're already in negotiations with them about signing an extension to that contract, and that should give us some further financial stability. I mentioned the fact that the income from events, conferences and training courses was down, but the costs were too. And nevertheless, training still performed very well in the number of delegates that we saw, initially through in-person courses, but then towards the back end of the year, our first foray into online training courses. As I mentioned earlier, the total funds remain 2.4 million. And overall, we ended up with a very small deficit once you took into account the unrealized losses on investments in this case. But as I've mentioned, there's been a very good recovery since then, so it's looking positive for this year. I traditionally have some charts, bit difficult to read over the screen, but you can see the huge purple area. This is our income, and it's primarily publications. The proportion to publications is obviously higher this year with the dip in events, training, etc. Going along with the incomes, the expenditure, pretty evenly spread, slightly different spread to normal, however. And we also look at some of the other charitable expenditure. So the proportions there have changed too. We didn't spend quite as much as we would have done on OR and education, the schools outreach program, and our pro bono projects were also reduced. We still managed to get quite a lot done in both of those areas, but pretty much all of it was virtual through the year. So that's the end of the informal part, the review of the year, if you like. Next steps are the Agm voting. We're doing this pretty much as we did last year. We've said in advance there'd be no voting at this meeting. That's all been done electronically by post. And just for simplicity in terms of the meeting, like we did last year, John Hopes, Janet Williams have both agreed to propose and second the motions. So I'm going to whistle through them very quickly now. First one was to do with the minutes of the AGM held last year, and that was approved. Second one, resolution number 3, was to approve the annual report and accounts for the year. That too was passed. That slide's actually wrong because it's to December 2020, not 21. We haven't quite got there yet. Resolution 4, we held a call for tenders to look at our auditing provision this year, and decided to go with new auditors for the first time in many years. So Sayer Vincent, a well-known name in charity auditing, will be carrying out our audit for 2021, starting some point next year, and that resolution was passed too. Resolution 5 was to do with a small increase in the membership rates, following the usual pattern of sticking with CPI. And again, that was passed. That's a special resolution, requires 75% majority. That was okay on that count. Next one was to do with accreditation fees, similarly going up by a very small amount. That too was passed. Resolution 7 was to do with the prices that we charge for additional hard copies of our journals. That will go up too. Passed. Number 8 was to do with postage on our overseas stuff for Inside OR magazine. Unfortunately, keeping track with increases imposed by Royal Mail. Again, that was passed. And resolution 9, the last one, was to do with the prices for our ORMS today, which is hard copies coming from the States. So again, taking account of the cost of providing that service. Again, that was passed. Okay, so that brings an end to the formal part of the AGM in terms of the resolutions. We thought we would finish off today's session with a very brief canter through an update to the business plan that the senior leadership team within the staff at the Society and board have been working on. This was presented to board earlier this year, and I shared this with a couple of committees and the staff. As you'd expect, the business plan itself sets out our mission, vision, aims, and strategic goals for the coming period. We introduced a new section that describes the different roles the Society plays, and I think that helps give a bit of context to what we do and how we sometimes go about that. The work is still separated into 6 strategic pillars. They remain the same from last year, but we presented it in a slightly different way. So we looked at what we do, our objectives, how we go about doing that, strategies, how we might measure that, and then the business as usual and strategic activities, how they fit into that. We also did a bit of mapping to demonstrate how that maps against our committee structure. So I'm just going to briefly introduce all of these. The mission statement hasn't changed, nor the vision for the future. So simply put, that's having a vibrant, visible and valued Society membership. The roles of the Society were a new thing. And as I say, I liked how this demonstrated some of the different areas that we worked. And sometimes these aren't, there's sometimes conflict between these things. So for example, working as a membership body, we want to provide valued services for our members, but sometimes that clashes with our charitable objectives, where essentially we have to provide benefit to society and the wider community. So yeah, that's an interesting context for the plan. Quickly run through the 6 pillars. I presented them in the form of a building, so supporting our overall objectives of advancing knowledge, interest and education in OR. So there are 6 of them, which you can read if you strain your head to the correct side. We'll be finalising the business plan and putting it on the website soon, so you should be able to read a bit more about what these things are. but they're developments of where we've been working over the past number of years. It's nothing radically different, really. And then we've got some foundations for our building, and there are values which we've introduced over the past couple of years. So I mentioned that we were breaking these down. So I've picked one of the pillars just to show you how we do it. We've got a description of what that pillar is, a sentence explaining what it is that we do there. We've got 3 elements about how we do it. So this one's about supporting OR knowledge development, and how we do it is through our academic journals, through our program of learning opportunities, through conferences and events, and attempting to increase the scale and impact of our research in OR. We've got a number of business as usual activities supporting this, and then some particular activities, strategic activities to help us move further forward with this. Underneath that, we have the 3 strategies again, and some KPIs that we're potentially going to be using to try to measure these at a pretty high level. Many of the committees that are looking at this in more detail would have a wider suite of KPIs to help them work with this, but this is sort of for the board level, society level view. And as I mentioned, we mapped all of the activities here to the different committees. Not to say that where there isn't a yes, that there isn't work going on there, but these were the main links. And this was a presentation I presented to the staff. So I finished off with a bit of a big up for the staff. And of course, underneath all of the foundations is the staff holding everything together, supporting all the good work that you as volunteers help us to do. So that's everything that I wanted to run through in terms of a whistle-stop tour of the latest version of our business plan. And I guess that effectively ends what we wanted to talk about now. But if there are still folk with comments or questions, quite happy to take them before we finish. Graham's waving and Ruth's got a hand up. Graham.
Goodness, I'm surprised to come before Ruth. I had 3 numbers that cropped up. We've got over 3,000 members. Didn't crop up particularly, but there's 30 or so members of the General Council. And there were about 20 people who voted in the AGM. And what conclusion do you draw from that?
Yeah, that was a disappointing turnout. I perhaps should have done a bit more to remind folk. I don't know, I'm afraid, what reminders did go out on the voting. I can check that up. Yeah, something to improve next year. Last year it was 55-ish, I think, voted, so it's disappointingly down from there.
Can I come in here? So, Graham, Gavin and I were actually discussing this earlier today. It is a disappointing turnout in terms of voting at the AGM, and I think next year we've got to do something to try and encourage a little bit more engagement and to improve those numbers. But you're absolutely right. Over 3,000 members and such a small turnout is disappointing. But we will work on that for next year. It is actually, I did check this with Gavin. It is actually quorate. So we're still quorate, but it's getting dangerously close to not being.
And then they're not the most exciting of topics to be voting on, of course. Important though they might be.
It's one indication of people's, as Edmund used the word engagement with the society, isn't it? But I'd have thought at least the General Council might have voted.
Well, I mean, actually, Graham, there are more people here in this meeting today than voted. So, you know, and clearly people who are attending the AGM, you know, I mean, what we've got 30 odd people here now, at the moment, 32 people from 3,000 membership. So the people attending today are clearly amongst the most engaged with the society, but not everybody here today voted. Yeah, but we will do something about that. It's a very, very good point. It really is.
Ruth, over to you.
What I wasn't going to say, but I will say, I voted this morning. I thought it was very poorly publicised. It was not that the right messages didn't go out at the right time, and I only realised I thought I might have missed the boat, and maybe I did. I don't know when you took the count. So, but what I was going to say was, in terms of increasing awareness of OR, the phrase operational research has been on the screen more times in the last year than ever in my memory, and I'm 67, because of Christina Pargle, and because her job title is Director of the Clinical Operational Research Unit. Do you have plans for exploiting that?
Yeah, Christina is certainly one of the options under consideration, shall we say, for awards later in the year.
So, I mean, externally. So all of those people who see Director, Clinical Operational Research Unit, and don't have a clue what the operational research in the middle means, you know, there's a big audience out there. And, you know, can we find a way, this is, you know, of building our external facing promotion to say, this is it.
Yeah, this is something that we're really working hard to do, Ruth. We're as I said, we're engaging with I think a wider variety of bodies than we did before. We're engaging with government and trying to raise the profile there, with a series of meetings that Gavin has put to play in place, where we are looking to raise the profile of operational research, particularly with policymakers and with government. But you make a very, very good point. We need to broaden that engagement even more, and look to draw upon our membership and our community as much as we possibly can.
Okay, Jane's mentioned a bit of difficulty in voting on the website. I'll investigate that. Ian, you're next up with your hand.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I come hotfoot from the University of East Anglia, at least virtually, which is one of my alma maters, and of course where Solly Zuckerman's archive resides. But a thought that I've had recently is about, can we do something equivalent to the, I think, was it Scientists and War, 1940, that explained the potentials of science. And I cannot, I've been trying to find a reference to it. I'm not sure if it's Zuckerman or or Blackett was involved in its writing, but I understand it was pulled together very quickly, and it presented the potentials of science for application to the new effort required. And I did wonder whether analysis for net zero, analysis for levelling up might offer a similarly broad target to bring together the things we can do. Because I've certainly seen Christina, I think, appearing on Newsnight, no less, some months ago. And as Ruth was saying, it's certainly the highest profile I think I've seen for quite a while for operational research.
Edmund and I were meeting with Chris Skidmore, last year's Blackett lecturer, earlier on today, to discuss what we're doing to follow up from his lecture last year. And one of the areas we're talking to him about is net zero.
Yeah.
So hopefully more about that soon. Ho Lo, yes, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. Yes, I must first just respond to the previous discussion or comment about engagement at that AGM here. And secondly, this item I want to ask in relation to the core value. So start with the response. to the observation of a person at the AGM. I must admit that this is my first time at the AGM virtually after all these years as a member of the OR Society for decades. So the reason why I'm here, there's many reasons. Basically, the broadly two reasons. One is because it's virtual, safe traveling, which is good, which is interesting because in other professional society, I observe AGM is a very boring, regarded as very boring activities that members don't tend to engage. And so usually we have very few people at the AGM in terms of membership. And the trick we used to do in other professional membership I observe is that they put AGM at the middle of conference so that everybody was there either during lunch or in the early morning or something. So that's one of the thoughts to share. And the second reason why I'm here in relation to what I've just said, to put the AGM at conferences, is the reason why I'm here today is because I'm interested to talk about the soft OR, which I commented on early on. So therefore, it draws people interest when you've got some activities going on, like conferences or today's talk, and people come for that rather than for the AGM per se. And that is my observations. So my question to raise hand is really respond to the last annual report about the core values of the society. And also you briefly mentioned about the definition of OR in response to my question early on is about the inclusiveness. The OR definitions of OR is inclusive and the value is inclusive, which is sound like music to my ears. And I observe also that in other professional society that I belong to quite a few, so my membership keep going up over the year or adding up. But that is just another issue. But the issue is about the strategic priority. Suddenly, I noticed in many other societies that I also belong to, making it very high profile in recent year, the last year and this year, is about equality and diversity and inclusiveness. And that seemed to me in response reactively on the news of Black Lives Matters and also gender equality and all those things on the media in recent years, especially pandemic COVID-19 showed the inequality of the society, including the PAME people in our society. So I just want to raise that and back to this table. I mean, in the last slide about the values of the OR, it's got a very lovely table about what it is and then how we do it and how we measure it with all the table. As I expected, it's fantastic. That's how I expected the OR practitioner and member to do things, which is quite professional, quite impressive, that's what I love about this society. But I just want whether something similar on the inclusiveness on the front, that is, and how we raise the agenda in terms of inclusiveness for people like myself, but also for the wider diversity and gender equality and so on and so forth. I just want to bring it to the table, bear in mind that I was one of the equality advisors for the former government. So I'm rather aware that we've been there before. Again, there are many initiatives I heard in other professional society. I keep become very passionate when I was younger, but also become very annoyed and bored because I thought, my goodness, I thought that we've been done it before many years ago when I was in government. We make the law and everything and make the change. And why we're still talking about the same thing. And then when they say, this time we're really making a change, and then they turn up all those strategic plan and action and all those were old hat, and I came across them before in my proper job. So I just want to throw this on the table. Sorry about long-winded moaning and make the point. The point rather anecdotal is that we've been there before, and what the OR society do about it, and I don't hear much about it in terms of like membership breakdown and all this in pie charts. It doesn't seem to square the circle. So I'll just raise that point again. I'm so sorry.
No, that's quite all right. It's very important to raise that point. As OR people, we like data, so we've been trying to collect data to support our initiatives here, and I think we need to get a bit better. The response to some of our surveys to get diversity data, either on gender or race, was a little bit disappointing, but we are trying to improve that. I think two things changed recently. We added it as a strategic priority, one of the 6 pillars in the business plan. That wasn't because we thought it needed separate attention, or rather we wanted it to be implicit in part of everything that we do, but we still thought it was important enough to bring attention to it by having it as a 6th pillar. And the work that we've been doing in recent times on this, responding to the Science Council framework exercise earlier in the year, really looks at every single part of what we do. All of our different committees, all of our activities are included in this, and I'm really pleased with how we've embedded it, and it's become really a part of everything that we think of. But there's a long way to go, and we'll carry on trying to build from that. The next exercise, the next benchmarking exercise, will be in 3 years' time, I think, and we're setting out what we hope to achieve before then, and we're trying to be as ambitious as we can with this.
I can assure all members that equality, diversity and inclusion is a critically important agenda for the society. I think Nicola is here at the meeting. Nicola is our board lead on this. I don't know if you want to say a few words, Nicola, but you're doing some outstanding work for the society, and it is something that we are very, very concerned about.
I guess just to kind of support what both you and Gavin have said, EGI is kind of really very important, and we're trying as best we can to focus our efforts to start to build up and I guess make improvement and change in particular areas, and then start to build on those. But I'm always very happy to chat with anyone in the society about EDI, to hear thoughts, in particular if you've got experience kind of in your day-to-day life on different organisations of how things have worked or haven't worked. Really happy to kind of hear and chat about those. So kind of please feel free to get in touch. Very happy to chat. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicola.
Okay, we've reached 4:30. Not sure we had a formal closing time, but now seems like a good time, unless anyone else has any questions or comments. Excuse me.
Don't see any hands raised, Gavin. So I would just like to say thank you to you all for attending. I really appreciate it. Thanks for your engagement with the society. Thanks again to the staff for putting this meeting on for us. Very much appreciate their efforts. So unless anybody's got anything to raise right at the end, I think I will close the meeting now. Thank you all very much. Goodbye.
Thanks, folks.